screen share or whatever?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can screen share. I don't know if I can like. Ooh, I can let people in and everything. Haha.
Yeah, I'm gonna start admitting folks so they don't go away.
Screen share or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of my students is here.
Awesome.
I can like.
Hi, Tiffany.
Ooh, I can let people in and everything.
Hello.
I'm gonna start admitting
How are you today?
Good. How are
Uh-oh.
you?
Good.
Yeah.
One of my students is here.
Awesome. Sorry, I was on, I had my thing going and so we were getting feedback from the live broadcast. I turned that off. That's scary. It's freaky.
Mike, will you make me co-host again so I can keep track of questions and stuff?
Oh, yeah. There you go. Oh. One of my students is joining. Welcome, Joe.
Students from all over the place. How's it going, Devin?
It's going very well on my part. Been busy. I'm
Good.
pledging a fraternity, but it's all fun.
Uh-oh, that could be trouble.
Yeah, it's trouble. But Mr. Kapoor or Dr. Kapoor, how's the baby coming along?
Well, not quite. We're at the any day now stage.
Ooh.
Yeah, I could run out of this talk right now. So.
Alrighty. Another one of my students is showing up. This is great. All right, we are definitely live on YouTube.
So
Hope you all don't. Oh, go ahead, Nathan.
that was not important.
Oh, Dr. Dobek is here. Okay. Well, folks, thanks for joining. We're going to obviously we'll give people a few minutes to come in here. It's not yet 3 o'clock. So just give us a moment. Talk amongst yourselves.
Need to play some music there, Mike.
I know. Yeah, I got that down for my classes now.
That's what I do.
Yeah, for the pre-class. That is, I've got it down on when we have like virtual classes. I still screw it up when I'm actually in person, but.
Hello, Nathan. Good to see you.
Hey, how's it going?
You too.
Welcome, Professor Crofthomel. Thank you for joining us again.
My pleasure. Good to see students here too. Nice.
Yeah, we got a good number of folks here. This is good.
My daughter's practicing electric guitar upstairs and will soon be having a clarinet lesson. So I will.
Cool.
I'll have to be on mute. Or else we'll have some
That's our
interesting
music.
background.
That's our music.
What's she playing? Turn it up. What's she playing?
She's just got the electric guitar last night, and then the clarinet will be Bagatelles.
Cool.
So,
Sounds good.
Is she?
do you play guitar?
When I was a kid, I used to, but not anymore.
Is she still in the squeaking phase?
She's not squeaking the guitar. The clarinet, not at all, but the guitar doesn't tend to squeak. We're just learning chords. So, so kind of
Yeah.
fun. Are you a guitar player?
No, I'm a clarinet player. So yeah, I was talking about
Yeah,
that.
no. Yeah, no, she's a 10th grader and she loves her clarinet and plays with the wind ensemble, so she loves it. Do you still play or?
Not really anymore. In high school I was first chair bass clarinet in the symphony, and I marched. I was section leader on the clarinet section, so I was able to get. um, I don't know. I was pretty good at it, but I'm rusty now.
You'd have to be pretty good to be in symphony. She played with Saint Cecilia until they stopped playing. So
Okay.
yeah, but yeah.
And I'm gonna let, some people are still coming in, so I'm gonna give people just like a minute or two more, and then we'll get started. Dr. Russer, is that how you say your last name?
Reeser.
Reeser. Okay, thank you. All right, I apologize about that, Reeser.
No, that's okay.
You can call me Hunter if you want as a result. So Dr. Reeser, thank you. I didn't want to screw it up at one in the formal introduction to the talk.
It was all recorded. You're already too late.
Yeah, I know. I already messed it up. So, all righty. Yeah, we'll give folks one more minute, and then we'll get going here. Well, it looks like we might have the audience that we're going to have, and so I'll get things started. Hello, I am Professor Michael Huner. I'm the chair of the GVSU History Department, and it is certainly our pleasure to be featuring the third talk of the Winter 2021 History Department Speaker Series, where we have Dr. Anna Reeser with us today. I'm not going to be formally introducing her. I'm going to leave that to my colleague, Dr. Kapoor. But I just want to welcome and thank Dr. Reeser for coming today and sharing her research with us. This is very exciting. And again, I guess one of the bright spots of the pandemic. So from, I believe, sunny New Mexico, as well as sunny West Michigan, because the sun came out again today. Just want to welcome everyone. And I'll hand things over now to Dr. Kapoor.
Thanks, Professor Huner, for the introduction to the introduction. I won't say too much, but I did want to welcome Dr. Reeser to GVSU. She has also graciously agreed to do an interview with me from my class in the Technological Revolutions class that we do here in the History Department on the space race. So my students will get a chance there as well to hear about her work. But I also asked that she present her current research to us here at the History Department. And today, she will be talking about women's place in the space program. So without further ado, Dr. Reeser, take it away.
Well, okay. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you, Dr. Huner, and thanks, Dr. Kapoor, for inviting me. Dr. Kapoor and I went to grad school together, so it's really, really nice to be here. And yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about a chunk of my book project that comes from my dissertation research that's about women working in the space program in the 1960s. I am a historian of technology, specifically spaceflight. My research is about space, place, gender, and visuality in the American space program. And my other roles are co-founder and co-editor-in-chief of Lady Science magazine, and I'm the co-author of a new book about women in the history of science that's coming out later this year. So I'm gonna share my screen because I have some slides for you. Let's do it this way. Okay, does that look good to everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Great. So this talk comes from, like I said, from my book research about placemaking practices within and around the space program in the 1960s. So the majority of that work is concerned with questions about visuality and materiality and images, geography and the environment, and the way that place as a social and cultural phenomenon is tied to locality. So that work uses this idea of place and placemaking, or how we sort of come to understand locations as distinct, meaningful, inhabitable, to use that to think about the early history of the American space program, just as it was building its extensive earthly infrastructure. So how do space places come into being, and what feeds into the meanings that we associate with these places? And there are a lot of ways into this question. And in the larger research, I select a few. So for example, like, how does Kennedy Space Center at NASA, as NASA described it at the time, quote, become the place from which our civilization goes out to other worlds, end quote. And it is suffused with meanings from kind of the tropicality of its environment, the legacies of colonialism and displacement in that space. Another example would be like in Houston, I look at the creation of the Manned Spacecraft Center, which is now Johnson Space Flight Center, and the transformation of the city into sort of Space City USA, which is like a high-tech Sunbelt metropolis with the space age Major League Baseball team and the Astrodome, all of that kind of stuff. But in writing about Kennedy Space Center in these sort of early days, we're talking like 1958 to 1964, particularly working with the installation's internal newspaper as a source, it's called Spaceport News, I began to think of the other ways we use the word place and what those might have to do with this kind of spatial and material meaning making that I'm trying to work with. So what kind of place was Kennedy Space Center in the 1960s is a question that I can answer in a lot of different ways. It was a tropical place, it was a military place, it was a technological place, but it was also a workplace. And I want to ask other questions of place in this context as well. So today I just want to talk about what is the place of women in the space program, and are women viewed as out of place when they participate in the space program, and why? So, okay. So this image is of Hangar S, which was the capsule checkout facility at Kennedy Space Center in the very early days, even before it was called Kennedy Space Center. And it is a high-tech place where men and machines are engaged in the important and often risky work of spaceflight. And as Reen Carpenter, who was astronaut Scott Carpenter's wife, put it in a piece she wrote for Life magazine, in talking about attending her husband's launch at Kennedy Space Center, she said, quote, "He wanted us there, but she means Scott. But more to the point, I wanted to be there badly. In that male atmosphere of Hangar S, Scott lived wedded to the capsule, taken over by hundreds of chain-smoking, coffee-drinking men who, with a quiet possessiveness, would work with him, launch him, and pray for his recovery. Only when their job was completed successfully would he be returned to me." So in this male atmosphere then of Hangar S, I really love this image. I think it is very excellent. So you can clearly see a secretary's workstation here with her typewriter and her desk and her handbag sitting on top of the desk. And so when I look at this image, it's a piece of technological documentation of, here's Hangar S, this is the capsule checkout room. In July of 1960, this is what it looked like. But also here is a place for a woman. And I always wonder, like, did she had she just like stepped away, or was she asked to like get up and get out of the picture by the photographer? I have a guess, but so there were a lot of women working for NASA in the 1960s, a lot of workstations like this. We don't actually know precisely how many, because NASA didn't keep those types of records until the 1970s, when they began recording employment data on gender and race. But by job division, I think we can see that there were many clerical workers at NASA. That is recorded in their employment data. And by inference, we can kind of assume NASA was very like other corporate environments of the time. So clerical workers are going to be women for the most part. And so we just don't have like a lot of specific information about people doing that kind of work at NASA in these very early days. We have more information about people who had technical positions, who were trained scientists or engineers, and they received some more kind of outside media attention and coverage. Some people like Rita Rapp, who was a physiologist, had become more kind of well-known recently, as NASA has kind of made efforts to sort of retroactively, diversify its own history in our kind of public consciousness. But as far as just like the majority of the women who worked at NASA, we don't have very good information. And part of this is because in some ways, aside from its mission to send people into space, NASA was very like other large mid-century aerospace firms, like private companies. And it was designed from the beginning to interface with companies like that as contractors. So NASA's organization would have been familiar to basically anybody in the corporate world at this time. The work culture was fairly standard to that kind of norm as well. And especially in terms of demographics, the gender division of labor, class divisions of labor, and just kind of the day-to-day management. The guys from North America and Rockwell could go to NASA and they understood what to do and who to talk to and where to go. So in trying to understand what type of place Kennedy Space Center was in the 60s, I found this employee newspaper to be a really valuable source, particularly as a collection of representational practices surrounding women in the workplace. I spent a lot of time with both the Kennedy newsletter, which is called Spaceport News, and the one for the Manned Spacecraft Center, which is called Space News Roundup. And I think these are really valuable documents, especially for my work in place, because they are about the self-presentation of NASA and its centers. They're not meant for wide public consumption, but then they're also not like the raw truth of what it was like to work at NASA. They're kind of in between, and they rely on the tropes and styles of newspaper media of the time, but they serve like a very specific audience. And at that middle ground, I think they can show us a lot about both the employee culture at NASA and the way that NASA fits into and relates to a kind of larger American cultural norms around work and corporate culture at this time. So they're really useful for me in looking to recover some scraps of the stories about these women that we just don't know much about, who weren't scientists or engineers or had larger public profiles. So I'm going to take you through some of the things I've found and just talk a little bit about these patterns of representation for women workers and kind of what they can tell us about the place of women at Kennedy Space Center in the 60s. And so I always like to start with these cartoons in particular. These appear in subsequent issues of Spaceport News from 1963. That was also the year that the president officially redesignated NASA's Launch Operations Center, which is what it was called initially, and renamed it Kennedy Space Center in sort of honor of the late president. So in 1963, this is like a very crucial moment of identity building for the center. It has its new name. It is really, the programs there are taking off and drawing more public attention. And I like to look at these newspaper sources as part of the process of this like identity formation of this place. So I think these are great because they're a good example of the kind of contradictory coverage we see of women in this paper. So you can see like on the left, the man has think written on his inbox, sort of signaling, you know, his work is intellectual and consuming. And whatever it is his secretary is doing is menial and probably distracting rather than integral to, you know, the serious labor of whatever this guy's thinking about, right? This cartoon became like a series, and they all have the same tone wherever it appears in the newspaper of women kind of like making silly or ignorant jokes about security clearances. They're more interested in gossiping than doing serious work. And of course, this image is meant for consumption by men. It's meant for consumption by the men who have think written on their inbox on their desk. And so these are really familiar, I think, stereotypes about secretaries. But they also tell us that these women had secret security clearances. So they're handling really important information. And I think this is something that I'm really fascinated with, the way that secretaries and administrative assistants and typists are understood in environments like this as simple just conduits for information, that they have no idea what's really on the papers that they're kind of pushing around, and that the labor they do to keep all of this organized is like entirely incidental to the functioning of the organization. So in that sense, they're treated like infrastructure, where men are treated like the creative and technical engines of the project. And that's something that I see a lot. So the cartoons, of course, are very stereotypical and overblown. And I think if we don't expect to find that kind of thing in a newspaper from the 1960s, like that's just naive. But I think that other representation in this paper kind of goes beyond that sort of simple expected, just sort of sexist, you know, stuff that we see. Because the special mission of Kennedy Space Center and NASA as an organization kind of conditions, you know, I said that NASA is very much like other large corporations, but NASA is also doing the space program. So it's a special environment. And there are just some assumptions embedded in these representations that I think are really interesting to look at. And the first one is that women are consistently separated from the work that they do. In many places in the magazine or in the newspaper, they're singled out as women in ways that disconnect this fact, their fact of being a woman, from the work that they do. And that's not always the case. You know, I think there are plenty of places where they're portrayed as sort of like amazing, rare lady engineers. But in the case of clerical workers in particular, and I think you can see this really well in the image on the left, this is reproduced from the Cape Side Inquirer, which is a newspaper local to Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And they interviewed some people who worked at NASA to ask them how they could contribute to the space program that they were already working for full time. And just as an aside, I appreciate the fact that Spaceport News didn't interview these women who worked at their place of business for which this newspaper was made. They just reprinted some from another newspaper instead of doing it themselves. But the important thing about this set of interviews, I think, is the way that the question is being posed. How can women contribute to the space program is being asked here of women who worked for the space program. So the question then, I think, isn't actually, what do you do as an individual in your work? And how does that contribute to the space program? The question underlying this is, what is the point of having women in the space program? And you can see in here that women give very typically kind of gendered answers about, quote, the ability to create a pleasant working environment, tact, humor, and good manners, lending encouragement to the men. And they do talk about the specifics of their work and how much time they spend trying to make sure they have as much knowledge as possible. But I think combined with other coverage, we start to get a picture of this kind of conflicted representation of women as very confident individuals doing important work, but also just as representatives of a workplace curiosity. What are all these women doing here? And I think women are also expected to perform certain images of femininity in the context of this newspaper. So you can see in the right-hand image, this one was done by the editors of Spaceport News, and it's just asking them, you know, about their clothing and what they like to wear to work. So here's a couple more things from Spaceport News. And I do think that what is happening here is the part of this has to do with the kind of early stirrings of the women's movement in the 60s. The Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, which Spaceport News did reprint parts of that in 1964, the Civil Rights Act. And, you know, NASA has always maintained that it was at the forefront of these social movements. They like to talk a lot about how they were hiring Black engineers before they were kind of mandated to by the Civil Rights Act. But I think it's important to distinguish between an institutional mandate and an actual culture change, like a palpable change that people feel. And so we can see that editors kind of addressing these larger kind of shifts in American life, but the representational practices of the paper really do reflect these kind of ingrained attitudes about women in the workplace and about women in a high-tech place like NASA. And because women are largely treated as a novelty, as like a workplace curiosity, the paper continually highlights how out of place they are in an organization dominated by men and engaged in this kind of masculine high-tech work of spaceflight. So on the left, we see Al Schill here being named Man of the Quarter by TWA, who is contracting with NASA to run infrastructure on Kennedy Space Center at this time. And the TWA vice president comments that, quote, perhaps this time the award was inappropriately named. And I just note that he says it was inappropriately named just this one time, but not in general. And then on the right, we have an engineer whose headline claim to fame in this paper is being pretty, in addition to enjoying challenging work. Jeanette Denny was a civil engineer, and you can see here kind of sprinkled throughout that she was very accomplished. She was the first woman engineering graduate at Tennessee University. Before coming to NASA, she worked at Oak Ridge. And interestingly, she worked in facilities utilization, which is literally the creation of the places of Kennedy Space Center. So this type of coverage of the women who worked at the spaceport was very common. And actually, I think that taken kind of in aggregate, it is largely positive. And there are just a lot of things that are just reflecting the organizational culture we would expect from any kind of large technology organization in this period. But one thing that I do try to do in my work is to not distinguish between engineers or scientists and other women who are working in different positions. I try not to draw a line too sharply between a sort of typically pink collar role that someone might have and those who had scientific training. Especially because I think that this just reproduces the kind of representations that we see in Spaceport News itself, this kind of like, how can women contribute to the thing that they are already contributing to? Everyone at NASA was doing spaceflight work, moving around information and managing kind of like interpersonal structures or whatever it is clerical workers are doing is spaceflight work because it's for spaceflight. And I think when we distinguish between technical and non-technical work within a technological organization, it really does amount to just kind of looking for ways to exclude people from the history of technology. So that said, I have just a couple more images that I would like to show you that I think demonstrate my last point, which is that if women are viewed as infrastructure or if they're viewed as a workplace curiosity, they are also in this context ornamental. And I think this really drives home the point that this paper caters to a male audience because Kennedy Space Center is a male place at this time. So prepare yourselves. So this is Evelyn Schwartz, who worked in the technical library at Kennedy Space Center and who is represented here as a pinup for the male readers of the newspaper. If you look at the caption, it notes that if the editors had not decided to publish this little piece of fluff about how the seasons were changing, quote, we wouldn't have had any reason to run the pictures of Evelyn. And so I've talked to some other space historians who are familiar with these pinups, and they go through Spaceport News and they're all over the place. They're unavoidable. But they're not, I haven't really seen them covered in like your kind of bigger histories of the space program. I more or less lost my mind when I saw them in the archive. And I wasn't sure exactly how I could fit them into my research on place and the kind of cultural geographies of spaceflight. And so in thinking about that, you know, in the larger research project, I focused on the representational practices of the paper and how they contribute as a whole to a sense of place at Kennedy Space Center, a feeling that Kennedy Space Center was a male-dominated workplace, that the paper kind of catered to the male gaze. And I think all that stands up fine and is part of the project. But in kind of looking at these images again while I was preparing for this talk, I started thinking more about place and the way that we can interpret this idea and kind of bend it and then shape it around the images, these images, I think in interesting ways. And obviously, you know, we can talk about this after and you can tell me if it sounds wacky to you, but so another section of my book focuses on the environmental dimensions of place at Kennedy Space Center. I borrowed the term tropicality from David Arnold to talk about the kind of larger cultural history of the space program and the area of Kennedy Space Center in particular as like a tropical place. So then I was also thinking, like, with respect to like this particular set of pinups, you know, are there questions I can then ask about life and work and spaceflight technology on the beach, this kind of sensibility of living near the ocean? So does it matter, for instance, when we analyze an image like this, that it was presumably more common to see your coworkers in bathing suits if you worked at Kennedy Space Center than in other places, just because of its proximity to the ocean and all the kind of recreational facilities? You know, but then there are like many NASA centers are located near the ocean. And we can also consider this in context with larger kind of representations of the space program in national media that wasn't intended only for employees. You know, the astronauts and their families appeared in their bathing suits in national media and Life magazine as well. So that's just kind of what I mean about thinking about place as a frame to kind of look through these sources in different ways. And so this last image is my favorite. And to kind of wrap up, I will ask you to take a little bit of a leap with me that may go nowhere, but will perhaps be like one last good example of how flexible I think this idea of place can be for thinking about the history of technology generally and this history of American spaceflight specifically. So in the archives, I found a set of records that were related to decommissioning the old buildings at Kennedy Space Center. Many of those old buildings were originally civilian structures or leftover Air Force infrastructure that were just sort of absorbed into Kennedy Space Center when the land was purchased for the installation. And I talk about it in my book as an example of the ways that NASA really changed the landscape of Cape Canaveral when it took ownership of that land, that change was very physical. Some of the buildings were houses, businesses on the beach that were then repurposed for sort of spaceflight purposes. Some were demolished. And I use that whole process to talk about the appropriation of the landscape through eminent domain and the kinds of practices of displacement and disruption that build the space program in Florida. So this is where you got to just take a leap with me. So I look at this image, which is another pinup, and it is another sort of similar to the last one. It's just an excuse to put a picture of a pretty lady in the newspaper. It's Halloween. And I think that this is it's a great image. It's nicely photographed and composed, and it's staged in a place that looks abandoned. So in the foreground, you can see a piece of glass clinging to an empty window frame. It's perfect for a spooky Halloween themed pinup, but I just wonder, NASA's building its spaceport, the very first of its kind, a technological project of just impossible scale, organized under the goal of landing a man on the moon. And they're doing all of this on land that first belonged to the Aiz people, later to settlers who farmed citrus there. And all around the site, there are archaeological digs, abandoned buildings from later eras, and remnants of a kind of deep past in this place. So in looking at something like this, and maybe imagining that this was taken at one of these buildings that was set to be demolished, maybe an old beachfront popsicle stand or something, just stuff that was left over on the land that the Space Center was built on. I think those questions are part of what we can ask when we ask what kind of place Kennedy Space Center was. And I think that all of these analyses can intersect with one another. And yeah, maybe this is a leap, but I found it very fruitful for my thinking about this, because it also makes clear that gender, or the history of women at NASA, the history of women in technology, isn't a niche in sort of interest or like sideline story that can be separated off from other histories like this. So looking at place this way and using this as a frame means that we do have to account for these pinups. We have to account for these editorial spreads on women workers. We got to account for the easy dismissal of clerical workers as not contributing to the space program. Because after all these people are here. They're all in this place working toward the same goal. And the history of spaceflight as a history of technology cannot exclude those themes and people and concepts that we deem non-technological, because they are all integral when viewed at the level of place. So my kind of guiding light in thinking about all of this is to check myself when I'm applying my kind of mental filters to the things that I encounter in my research, and asking myself, what is it that we mean by technical or technological in the history of technology? And then what people, things, places do those filters exclude? And should we be making an effort to not do that, to include them instead? So I hope we get a little chance to chat, and if you have any questions, but thank you so much for having me. It was really nice to share this work with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reeser, for sharing that. I do want to have a chance to have some questions, and what I will ask is that if people will raise their hand in the Zoom chat, I'll kind of call you out as I see them. If you're not wanting to ask it out loud, please feel free to throw it in the chat, and I will ask it there as well. And before I forget, because I will forget, Dr. Reeser, would you put that last slide back up on the screen?
Damn it. Sure.
Just it is worth mentioning. It wasn't on the screen long enough. If you have a chance and you're interested in Dr. Reeser's work, she and a co-editor, Layla McNeil, just published a book, Forces of Nature: The Women Who Changed Science. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I'm super excited to read it. It will come out later in April, and I promise you will enjoy it. And please also check out their work at the Lady Science. It's a magazine that publishes a monthly newsletter, and they also host a podcast. If you're interested in this kind of work, I know that they would enjoy your support, but you would also enjoy reading their work and benefit from it greatly. So I did want to say that because I would forget later, because I'm really bad at keeping track of that kind of stuff. But let's get to some questions. I'll take the first one I've got here in the comments from Professor Shapiro. She asks, what role did women play in the creation of these images? Was the newspaper staffed by women in part or in the whole?
Yeah, that's a great question. There were, I believe, a few women who did work at the paper, and looking at this source, I was looking at a good 8 years of a weekly paper. And so definitely duties changed hands over the course of the paper's life. There, as far as I could tell, there were women who worked on the paper, but not as editors. And so without more information, I can't say very much about how much input they would have had into these images. I mean, you can say that like the women who went out and posed for these pinup photos, like volunteered to do that, obviously, or were asked to, and did so, I'm hoping willingly. But yeah, part of the problem with this kind of work is that it is just really difficult to get a good grip on what exactly women are doing in this moment, because there's just I'm kind of piecing it together from these types of sources, as opposed to having, like, in later periods of NASA's history, the employment data is much more robust. The stuff for this period is basically just like, there are 3,000 clerical workers, and that's all I have.
Right, and then Devin.
So earlier, Dr. Reeser, you mentioned that the women had security clearance and like sharing information with them wasn't like seen as exactly good. Why were these women granted the security clearance in the long run, like if giving them the information was seen as kind of like a downside?
I think the cartoons reflect more of just a general stereotype of secretaries as like a class of workers that are gossips or whatever, and that's largely because they're women. And I think that would have read as true to a lot of the men working there. But I think the reality is that at this very early stage, we're still talking about the spaceflight programs in the United States being very much just sort of emerging into a civilian space, and just now sort of becoming, a spectacle for the public. Most of what they're doing is incredibly classified, and it is oriented toward this kind of Cold War competition with the Soviets. So everything is super locked down. So the secretaries and clerical workers who have to type all of this stuff and who have to maintain all of these records, they have to have the same clearance as the people for whom they're doing the clerical work. So yeah, I think the cartoons, they're kind of weird to get your head around, but I just like to point out that, like, yeah, they're portraying them as these stereotypical gossipy secretaries, but they all have like secret security clearances, which are not easy to get.
Thank you very much.
And I have another question here in the chat. Could Dr. Reeser comment on the representation of Black women and women of color at NASA?
Yeah, there's not very much of it. I think I found maybe 2 pictures of Black women in Spaceport News that I can think of off the top of my head. Again, we're talking about like 8 years of weekly papers. the one that stands out to me, the one that I remember the most, is I can't remember exactly what her job description was, but she worked at NASA. But the piece that was in the paper about her was that she won a basketball tournament. And I think there are just very few women of color. I think when we talk about women working in the space program in this period, we are a majority talking about white middle-class women, younger single women, and older married women. But that's kind of like the demographic. And then in Spaceport News in particular, I really can only think of maybe like 2 or 3 places over the 8 years I looked at. So.
Any other questions? Yeah, Jason, go ahead.
Let me unmute here real quick. Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Reeser, for your talk. It was very interesting. As you think about your book project you said you're working towards, I wonder if you could synthesize what is your larger overall argument? It seems that you're talking about how on one hand women are compartmentalized into a certain space, but there's also terminology and some of the evidence that you use that suggests that women might have been occupying a kind of a liminal space. You see words like efficiency as kind of a masculine term alongside words like encouragement and emotional support, which are clearly feminine, right? So I wonder, do you see women as just kind of compartmentalized in a certain kind of box, or do you see them as represented in a space that is a little bit more liminal and ambiguous there? What is your larger thesis or argument that you want to put forward?
Yeah, I mean, with this section of the research, there is an accompanying section about women who visited spaceflight facilities, who didn't necessarily work there, but who also had their kind of experience of spaceflight constrained in certain ways. And so my overall argument is one, I think you're right to use the term liminal. I think it is one of liminality and of contradiction. Like I said, I think that the coverage of women spaceflight workers in this newspaper in particular is overall, in the aggregate, pretty positive. But I think that the editors of the paper and NASA itself, and even the women who are working in these spaces, are navigating some pretty serious changes to the culture of the American workplace in this period, and also the kind of particular constraints of working at NASA. And as NASA is building its own identity and trying to decide what kind of place is NASA for the different people who are at NASA. And, you know, I'm always really reluctant to give NASA more credit than I think they deserve in stuff like this, but NASA is pretty, I think in comparison to other places, pretty inclusive at this time. I just think that it is very interesting to look at these kinds of, like you said, liminal spaces that women occupy. So the sort of accompanying stuff that goes with what I've shared here talks about the way that the wives of the astronauts are kind of corralled and like herded around when they are at Kennedy Space Center, and that there are very strict rules about where they can be and kind of what they can do. Women reporters who I have evidence from the public affairs office files were apparently just a huge headache for the public affairs officers because they were like pushy and like rushing the pool line, and these kinds of internal representations of like, how do we get a grip on these women running around the spaceport during launches? And like there was a beauty queen who the PAO was extremely mad that she had been invited because he thought that she was just creating a spectacle of herself. Shirley MacLaine was at a Gemini launch. He hated that too because he thought she was just going around like for clout or whatever. So that's the kind of the larger bit, I guess, about women in these spaces. And then the larger research project itself is just about the construction of space places in all of these various ways. The sort of treatment of women, or the control of their movements or their representation as workers, is one bit of that, I guess.
Thanks.
All right, and then Allison, I'm going to ask your question. She asked that you mentioned that NASA's culture was moving towards a more civilian environment. Did you come across any information about how military culture might have influenced the inclusion of pinups and the style of the weekly magazine?
I think that is a really good question. Yeah, that's something that I think I'm still working through, because especially right at this moment, like I said, that NASA is sort of trying to move into a civilian space. NASA's charter is specifically a civilian agency, but most of the infrastructure that they're using in the very early days is like old Air Force infrastructure. Many of the people who work for NASA in important positions came right over from the military. All of the original astronauts, military experience, and many of them had combat experience. So there is a highly kind of militarized underpinning to the culture at NASA in this period. And I think I haven't found any sort of explicit evidence, that I could tie that together, but that's a reasonable assumption to me about the pinup thing. But I think if you also look at kind of like a wider sort of media glimpse at American life in this period, it's not all that unusual for women to be portrayed in this way. And then another thing that I just thought of just now that I do want to do is that a lot of other government installations like this had newspapers. Oak Ridge had a newspaper that was kind of similar to this. And to see how I want to kind of get into that space of these like huge government organizations that have their own like in-house media, and like that as an ecosystem for thinking about like labor and gender and representation in this period.
All right, and then Professor Huner had a question as well.
Thank you, Dr. Reeser. Yeah, I just actually have two questions, if it doesn't, if I'm not taking too much of the air there. The first one's a follow-up to Professor Buckridge's question. And it's also a follow-up to, I think, one of the claims you were making in your talk, where we don't want to separate or distinguish, I should say, between different types of workers who are involved in the space program. Just focus on the folks doing the kind of the specialized technical work, thinking about the clerical staff and that sort of thing. And I wonder how far we can expand that out then, like to the cleaning staff or the construction workers, right? And that's why I wonder where, not that that's coming up in your sources, or maybe you haven't kind of worked at, or haven't seen sources that are reflective of that, but that's why I wonder where obviously you potentially, thinking it being in South Florida, find more workers of color, right, who are involved in the overall operations. Everyone from Afro-Latinos, Black Cubans to Haitians to obviously other type of Latinos and people in African descended peoples who are living in South Florida. My immigrant population, that was just one thought I had, because in terms of, and I guess as part of that is beyond the print sources, what other records have you examined in your book, or what other sorts of, I guess, sources are you encountering and using to kind of make some of the broader points you want to make? Thank you.
Yeah. So one thing that I will say is that something I think that is very much needed in spaceflight history as a subdiscipline is a working class history of the space program, because I think it's very difficult to get a good handle on exactly what you're saying about the other types of workers. The reason that the clerical workers are featured in the paper is because they're there in the offices and they're in those spaces. And I think the existing history that even comes close to kind of touching on that working class history, a lot of it is literally just like a bunch of construction workers had a labor dispute and they went on strike, and it was really bad that they did that because they're just a bunch of socialists. So that's kind of like the level of investigation that has so far, kind of the depth of that. And so there just are not very many, like, there's not a good like sort of secondary jumping off literature to get started on that, but it's something that I'm very interested in. And as far as like sources for the larger book project, I look at all of the newspapers, but I also spent a lot of time in thinking about Kennedy Space Center doing its own kind of identity formation. I spent a lot of time looking at the Public Affairs Office papers, which were really interesting. And the first Public Affairs officer at NASA came from a newspaper background, and he really shaped a lot of this sort of early image of NASA. He wrote both with the work he did kind of behind the scenes, and then he also wrote publications for NASA's education outreach type of things. And so I think in looking in those sources, that's very limited in terms of how I can talk about working class people and people of color in particular, because they're just pretty much beneath the notice of the Public Affairs Office. So part of what I've been doing is trying to get a good grip on where I would look for that information. And with NASA, it is kind of difficult because of things that are kind of archived, only deal with, you know, certain subjects and only deal with certain things. So it may be a matter of like doing some more oral history, recovery and ethnography kind of work, but it needs to be done. Yeah.
I wanted to make sure and get to a few more students as well. Nathan, can you go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I was just curious if you might be able to talk about any sort of relationship between the use of women in the media from NASA and sort of the larger international competition with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's a good question. I see where you're going with that. I think for Spaceport News, because it's kind of an internal publication and it has this very dedicated audience of NASA employees, they're not doing very much kind of like propagandizing, because I mean they are, but not in the sense that it's ever going to reach any other audience. So they're doing, you know, there's definitely like a tone of like creating like unit cohesion and loyalty and stuff like that within the agency and within Kennedy Space Center as a workplace. The representation of women in spaceflight work as a kind of like propaganda tool, I think happens in like it does happen in like a national media. The problem, I think, for the United States, if they have wanted to do this, is that they just refused to hire any women astronauts. And so that was the major hurdle for them to be able to do that. And the Soviet Union, in contrast, did make a huge big deal out of Valentina Tereshkova's flight, and the fact that, you know, women in Soviet society are just as equal. See, we send them to space as well to potentially die. And NASA had its most famous astronauts get up in front of Congress and testify that they thought that women could do that job. So it just really wasn't a priority for NASA at the time, and they apparently didn't see the value of that as a political tool, engaging with, you know, the international community.
Thank you very much.
All right, I believe Devin had another question as well.
Yeah, thank you. So earlier, I think it was Dr. Huner, he commented on like other people like Cubans. And so that made me think of like, well, yeah, Florida had a ton of Cubans due to the like what was going on. And so I was just wondering, like, did NASA actually hire all those new people coming into the country, or did NASA almost actively avoid bringing them into the workforce?
I mean, I can't answer definitively, but what I will say is that an important thing to remember about NASA is that the majority of people who worked on the space program didn't work for NASA. They worked for NASA's contractors. And I think in addition to, we need a general kind of working class history of people who were employed by the agency, a broader history of NASA's contractor network and kind of corporate histories of these places married to the history of the spaceflight program, I think is a really important thing that still hasn't really happened. I think that's where you would find that information, because I mentioned like that TWA contracted with NASA to do like the tours, to run the visitor center when that was built, and to kind of manage all the infrastructure and logistics of like showing people the space center and all of that. And I think if you're looking in places like that, where it's not like they're looking for engineers who they're going to take from a pool of like white educated people, they're looking for working class people. The contractors is where it's at, because NASA didn't really do that kind of work itself. It contracted it out.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Got a few more minutes for some. Well, while you're thinking, I'll ask a question.
Uh-oh. Now I'm in trouble.
So one of the things that I found the most interesting, at least in the photos that you showed us, and I'm sure there are photos that would be contrary to what I'm about to say, but that I found surprising, is that in these pinups, with perhaps the exception of the office space that you showed, there is an absence of anything that has anything to do with space, or the way people were portraying space in the 1960s as the ultimate object of NASA. And in the writing in the newspapers around those photographs, do you find that to also be the case? Is the point of a lot of those newspapers and the point of the language about women in the spaceports explicitly to not be about space or something else?
I think there is a lot less talk about spaceflight and space technology where the paper is focusing on women than in other kinds of editorial focuses that happen. The paper itself as a whole is very concerned with like, here's the date of the next launch. Here's this engineer who got a promotion for doing this thing. Here's all this like news that's happening and exciting things and hearings at Congress. We got this much money. All of those things that you would kind of expect of like how we keep everybody updated. But yeah, I would say that when you see women in spaceport news, you see them as pinups. You do see them talking about their jobs sometimes, but you also see them like, this is the date of the next women's club meeting, and this is what it's like to be the wife of an astronaut, and things like that. I obviously profile like women engineers and people who win awards and things like that. But yeah, I think that they're and I think that contributes to the kind of how could women contribute to the space program kind of feeling of that representation, even though they're right there doing it.
Yeah. All right, thank you. I have more, but I'll wait. Professor Shapiro and then Professor Huner have another question.
Actually, I think Phoenix had a question. Phoenix,
Oh.
he did a hand up?
Yeah, I was just wondering, speaking of your focus on place, what was the early relationship between Cape Canaveral and the surrounding area? Was it a happy relationship, or was there resentment because of the takeover?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the relationship between Kennedy Space Center and the kind of the region as a whole was really complex. People who lost their homes and farms to eminent domain, not huge fans of what went down, particularly because that process of purchasing the land, it had to happen very quickly. And so they did try a little bit to go through and like offer everybody a good amount of money or whatever. And some people refused, and some people were told, if you move up here a little bit further north, you should be fine. And then they kept expanding the parcel of land that was needed. So at least one family had to move like 3 times because they kept the Corps of Engineers kept coming back and saying like, ooh, sorry, we're gonna need your house. So that definitely was not something that everyone was very excited about. And that I think is true of any eminent domain seizure that the government does anywhere. As far as like a kind of like turning it into a tourist destination, like that went fairly well. Although there are stories, particularly from the early days, of Cocoa Beach turning into a kind of like hive of scum and villainy, because you would have contractors coming in to work at Cape for, you know, a week or so, and then they would go into Cocoa Beach and just cut loose. So that wasn't fun. When there were launches, things got pretty crazy, just in terms of, especially like Apollo launches happening later in the 60s, things really did kind of get a little overwhelming. They had to build new roads and stuff to kind of accommodate all of the traffic that would happen. And I think in general, the program's image as kind of like a friendly civilian program focused on science and engineering was something that took time to build. And I think it eventually won people over, but the early days it was really complex. And I think it's a really interesting history.
All right, Carolyn, and then Steve's question.
Yep, okay, so I guess I was asking, I was wondering, okay, so I'm a former Girl Scout leader, thinking of, were these women who worked in the NASA offices running all this stuff, working efficiently, were they also community leaders and the same people who are running the PTA, and is there significant overlap?
Yeah, I think that there probably is. Again, it is hard to kind of make those specific connections. Oftentimes people aren't even named in the newspaper. But I did find, so at Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, there's sort of a similar kind of working environment. Lots of clerical workers, lots of women worked at NASA. I also found some sources from the Temple Beth Israel in Houston, that is a space themed cookbook that the Sisters of the Temple put together. And so that tells me, you know, it says in the book that like they either worked for NASA themselves or were married to people who worked for NASA, and that they connected their community, their kind of their community as in their religious observances and community to their work at NASA, and they were proud of it in that way. I see lots of mentions of like various women's clubs have announcements in these newspapers. And I think particularly in Houston, because there's some like geographical stuff that plays into how all of this works out with like Houston building basically a brand new suburb around the Manned Space Flight Center, and how that creates a kind of like really insular community. All the astronauts live in the same neighborhood, things like that. that change those dynamics, but that's something that is represented in my sources and something that I think could be chased up better. I'm just not exactly sure how to do it.
And then Professor Buckridge had another question. Specifically about, again, perceptions of women of color at NASA more generally, and bringing to mind Mary Jackson as depicted in the recent film Hidden Figures. Can you comment more on that?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, the numbers are pretty small of particularly, I think, Black women working in the space program at this point. And I think that, okay, I don't want to say that like Hidden Figures has like blown up that history and that it's completely kind of overtaken our ability to imagine what it was like in the 60s, but it kind of has a little bit. And I think probably Margot Shetterly would agree, just with the way that it has been kind of, it has really taken over a lot of perception of both of women at NASA, but in particular of Black women at NASA. I can't say anything specific to it other than just that there were very few Black women who worked at NASA, and that that I feel sometimes that the representation of something like Hidden Figures has outstripped the actual history that's been done on it. Margot's book is amazing, obviously. It's fantastic, and it is a scholarly book. So it's really cool that she got a movie deal for it. But she is one of only a few historians who are working on this subject, and there just really isn't that much. So it's more work is needed. I think I could say generally about most of the questions I've been asked is that space history is actually a fairly young field. And we're still trying to kind of claw our way out of doing like really good, really useful institutional histories of NASA, organizational histories, super good. They're lacking in the like cultural department a little, and so we're working on it.
Thank you. And then I think we'll take one more question. I think Professor Huner had a question, but I'll ask if anyone else does as well.
I'll go unless there's no other questions. I mean, I'll go only if there's no other questions, is what I want to say. Yeah.
Looks like it's all you.
Awesome. No, this is just a kind of follow-up question, Professor Buckridge, in terms of pop culture stuff and what your general thoughts are on it. I didn't finish it, although my son did, the Challenger documentary on Netflix. But I remember watching, I think it was the first episode, and fascinating, right? Because I remember sitting in a classroom in second grade and then seeing that, right? And it was just absolutely shocking. Anyways, one of the things about the doc, however, and this can expect to Nathan's question too, which I thought was a really quite good question about kind of the Cold War and the space race and all that sort of thing, and what the sort of things that the Soviet Union would be advertising in terms of especially gender equality that the United States just didn't bother with at the time, right? But nonetheless, what was coming out of that Challenger documentary is that finally, right, by the late 70s and the early 80s, there's a push for that, and it's not just a push for gender equality, but also kind of more racial diversity in the representation of not just representation, but the actual astronauts, right? And I think in that fateful flight, right, we really lost a national treasure, Ron McNair, I believe, the scientist from South Carolina who grew up in segregated South Carolina and became an astronaut. So anyways, I was just wondering what your general thoughts were on that, if you had any, if you saw it, because that's one of the things I thought was interesting about the documentaries. It was actually playing with that social and cultural history that you were making reference to.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I've been kind of trapped in the first 8 years of the of NASA's existence in this research, and I know actually comparatively very little about the space shuttle program. But yeah, this is definitely, I mean, the space shuttle program and the new classes of astronaut, by the time they were ready to start recruiting, there was basically no way that they could make it the same kind of macho test pilot, hot stick jock kind of cohort of astronauts. People have moved on. It just wasn't the same. And also the point of the space shuttle was that everybody can fly in it, and that you can be a payload specialist and not be a pilot, and that's totally fine. And that it's very safe, and it was meant to prove that anybody could go to space. So it was important in that respect too. Again, just me not wanting to give NASA too much credit, but yeah, having women and people of color, particularly Black people, in the space shuttle program was basically, it was like a no-brainer at that point. And I think because there's a lot less pressure at this point, it's not really a space race anymore or a competition. I think part of the reason the United States was just like, we can't talk about women right now, is because they were just so concerned about what would happen if they lost. I mean, that's why they kept moving the goalpost back. That they didn't really understand the kind of the cultural ground game that the Soviet Union was really working on with their space program. So yeah, I haven't seen it yet. I need to sit down and watch it.
No, that's okay. I haven't seen the latest Pele documentary either on Netflix, even though. So now that's there's a lot to watch, right? You know,
there really is. Yeah.
Got to get through Ozarks first too, right? And that sort of thing. So anyways, no, thank you. I'll stop there.
We all know that the real job of the historian is to watch all of the pop cultural references to the field of expertise so that they can correct people. That's why we all got into this business in the first place. Well, kind of at the end of our time here, thank you so much, Dr. Reeser. Thank you all for all of the wonderful questions. I once again want to say, please check out her and Layla McNeil's book, Forces of Nature, coming out at the end of April, as well as their work at Lady Science. I promise you will enjoy both of them. Thank you all so much, and see you next time. Oh yeah, we can clap or throw the emojis into Zoom. I'm not even sure what the right approach is to applause these days, but yeah, the applause is very much deserved.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Dr. Huehner. Thank you, Dr. Kapoor. It was really great, and the questions were so good. You guys had really great questions. You made me really work for it. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Reeser.
Yep.
Here's that clarinet.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
She's practicing the metronome applause.
Yeah, she's in a lesson right now. She's got her teacher upstairs. But anyway, thank you very much. That was really interesting. The thing I was going to ask, but